Firstly, I'm privileged to be here with all my friends, well-wishers, and particularly those who are my professors and teachers. Samirda was not my direct teacher, but I've been reading his works for a decade or so. It was a pleasure, listening to you, and we discussed even Pradip that I have much to criticize. This was all welcome because in the mood of an affirmative deconstruction, critique is always not simply unpacking, but bringing pieces together again, for a sort of new harvest. So that's nice. So I'll first respond to some of the points, but I'll also make a point as to where I really began, and that point, so far as it is concerned with itself, since some 2000, the year 2000, when I first wrote my editorial page article in Anandabazar Patrika on personal attacks, it has remained undisputed in a sense. This is a starting point. There's no doubt about the private and the public being legal juridical categories. There's no question about it. If your privacy is violated, you can go to the court and ask for redressal, right? You have public norms, public rules. If they are violated, there is a criminal law and all kinds of stuff. But say, for instance, of love or friendship, can I go to a court and file, a petition that I've been betrayed? For love or friendship are canonical examples of, personal relationships and the personal that I construe. Now, if love and friendship is the beginning point, then even we had that talk, with Pradipda, because Pradipda was busy. I said, have you been reading my book? He said, yeah, I am reading, but I know your argument, but I've been busy on some other work. So what it seemed from his comments that he didn't have the adequate time to go through my book in detail. Had he did so, if he had done so, I think many of the observations would have been revised. And in future, because these observations, the discussion is going to go as a supplement in another book. So I'm going to procure those discussion as well, comments. So they will be in a written form as well. So that written form will be in an extended argument and an engagement, right? But here, in a briefly sort of telegraphic form, firstly, as it has already been clarified, who is a person? I've discussed this in the preface, right? Who is a person is not my starting point. Who is a person? This discussion is particularly there in analytic philosophy, and I've quoted analytic philosophical arguments and also Habermas's, how he sort of rejects the analytical arguments, because it is solely a question of language by which they discuss the philosophy of identity. So my discussion does not begin with who is a person, right? But in future, one could make a kind of a collective engagement in which continental philosophy and analytic philosophy. In fact, this is a curious point as to why continental analytic philosophy begins and ends with this question: who is a person? What is personal identity? Bereft of all history, and particularly that person and the personal could be discussed without any reference to modernity. So I refer to Hegel particularly, as Habermas often points out. For Habermas only, modernity becomes a problem for the first time. Not even Kant, though Kant discusses in some form, private and public, whatever. So Hegel is the most crucial point here. And I also make a point that it was the neo-Hegelians of colonial Bengal, particularly Hiralal Haldar and Brajendranath Sheel, who actually instituted this kind of personal in a new form. And there the question of collective person and personality crops up. Okay, so the question of, I think, even Pradipda refers to Strawson's. I actually refer to Strawson in the conclusion. His discussion reference to the person as a category being a logical primitive. Okay, now Pradipda talks about the frame of analysis, Locke, Hume, and Hegel. I've not discussed Hume because, as I told you, I mean, Locke I've discussed, but from a very social and political viewpoint, right? My discussion is basically a contribution to social and political philosophy, spanning social theory, legal theory, and all kinds of stuff. But I'll talk about if the question of framework crops up, then I can clarify that what is this frame that I'm trying to, project. I've called this, and I've also referred to, though the word has been used before, but I've called this approach the personalistic approach. Now, what is this personalistic approach all about? First, I mean, if any problem as a thought exercise is given, if you can make a if you can bring up public and private, I try to see how the personal escapes it by his maneuver, deception, right? The moment I can show that the person, by his maneuvers, can escape the private and the public parameters, this frame can be applied in politics, in ethics, and I've really did this as a sequel. This has been published by the Indian Institute of Advanced Study called Categorical View, Personalistic Ethics in Social Work and Other Structures of Helping, where I tried to show, even in microcredit programs, right? Microcredit programs in Bangladesh, in Tamil Nadu, where the wives who have received microcredit, right? All their savings have actually been usurped by their husbands, but they are projecting that as their own savings, right? Now, if this is not deception, but if this is a fact stated otherwise, then the question of personal maneuver becomes crucial. In politics, for instance, we have all these public-private distinctions. We have all knowledge of public norms and private restrictions. But can you, for instance, describe a politician by this maneuver? We have all knowledge of how we could be cheated, but we are cheated every day. Why this knowledge does not suffice? Because the person has immense power of deceiving, of manipulating. He manipulates the private and public parameters to his own advantage or even disadvantage. I mean, one could get into a peril, one could be, one could die, one could commit suicide. So, not that it is always to his own interest. So the distinction between passions and interests that once Hirschman made is irrelevant. Okay. So this is a personalistic framework that I'm trying to propose in various forms. And this can be applied in politics, in ethics, in literature, all kinds of, in social or welfare work, all kinds of stuff. Right. Now, in terms of Pradip that talks about the personality part, which he thinks I've ignored. Now, I've talked about personality, but personality, I think it has to be inquired deeply. Why the question of personality has been appropriated by social psychology, ignoring, Mead and all others. George Herbert Mead I've quoted, I've cited, I've used. Margaret Mead I've not used. But it has been appropriated by social psychology. And they're trying to, that social psychology tries to build strict, knowable parameters in order to describe personality types, personality disorders, right? But this description, as you know, it's totally redundant today. It's totally redundant. For instance, because I have been trying to develop this framework in terms of our relationship with animals, in terms of animanity. And many have reminded me on Facebook and others, well, Hitler was a vegetarian. How could you say this? So in terms of, personality description, even Adorno's, study of authoritarian personality, no Adornians or Frankfurt School people would describe Adorno's authoritarian personality as a very, kind of authentic tone today, even, right? So this is one. And in terms of Freud, I've used Freud. Max Weber, of course, it goes extensively. And Max Weber is crucial because Weber actually tries to make the point, it's my starting point as well, that personal or the person, it was, the beginning was in the form of a privilege. I mean, the monarchical person is the first person in which the private and the public are united. It is from the body of the monarch that after the liberal distinction, after the fracture came, that the private public originated, and the divide was, and this monarch was reinvented by what you call the emergence of the dictator. And I'm so glad that Samirda actually, caught this spirit, that whether I'm sort of, where my sympathies, determinate sympathies lie. I'll answer this question later. So, in terms of Purusha, or D.P. Mukherjee, Pradipda is a specialist, and he has written a very good, very extensively helpful book in Bengali, in which D.P. Mukherjee features. He has also written a chapter. But I've mentioned D.P. Mukherjee here to say just one, because I would have strayed from my main argument if I had engaged it extensively. The D.P. Mukherjee's arguments are in toto, and I have here the notes which I could not use. He refers to Hiralal Haldar, and his major arguments are borrowed from Hiralal Haldar. Okay. But if D.P. Mukherjee is considered in terms of his own originality, trying to project Purusha as personal, right? And I've also voiced this to Pradipda in a private conversation, that the word Purusha, the Purusha, how can you escape the metaphysical definition of Purusha? Without, if D.P. Mukherjee is trying to deploy the concept of Purusha in a sociological, as a sociological inscription, how can he escape the metaphysical definition of Purusha? He cannot. And which I have said in the book that I pursue this in a separate paper, that he wrote everything under the shadows of Haldar, that his own discourse does not escape the distinction that he is trying to avoid. He is trying to make a distinction between the individual and the Purusha. Did he practice that in his discourse? I, for instance, in my own writings, I have to be always on my guard that I protect my own distinctions. Do I practice my own distinctions? He could not. He did not, and he could not. And so far as the distinction between the individual and the person is concerned, I've discussed this in the conclusion particularly. That person and individual distinction, these are quite old distinctions. They have been made. But the person and individual distinction, you cannot stop at that. For instance, I'm a private person. When I go outside, I'm in the public, I'm a public person, right? So, the moment I am private, I am public, I am sort of individual person, I'm also a collective person. Now, who is a collective person, as Samirda's question? Now, collective personality, I've discussed this, but in terms of Durkheim, in terms of a collective mind, collective personality, who is a collective personality can be ascribed to the state, to the crowd, everybody. But it has, as Samirda's genuinely pointed, it has deeply authoritarian implications. Like the monarch who contains and sustains the private public in his own body, the dictator, Nazi and the communist interventions, they did do away with the distinction between the public and the private. The Gestapo could have come at 2 p.m. at night and knock at your door. He could have arrested you. There was no private-public distinction at all. Now, where my sympathies lie, that's a separate question. I'll come later, and I'll end with that. Now, Pradipda talked about Habermas and Arendt. Private is constituted in the public. Now, I have written a separate paper, and I've made a reference to that paper in which the feminist construction of personal and personal is political is concerned, right? I've tried to show that the feminists confuse the personal and the private. If you want, what did the feminists mean by saying that the personal is political? That those problems, right, as a problem-solving procedure, those problems which are considered private, they could be taken to the public for scrutiny and legislation, right? They were not to be sort of kept aback. They were not secret, right? That was a conspiracy, in a sense, right? But what Habermas pointed out very well, that the private and public have separate validity claims. I mean, if you say that the private is public, then what about the distinctive validity claims of the two? If they emerge in modernity with separate distinctive validity claims, they cannot be confused, they cannot be brought together, right? So all private, so-called private matters could be brought to public. If they could be brought to public, fine. Then they have established legal parameters. But the question in terms of an autobiography, what I shall argue, I've already argued in Categorical Blue, there's a portion on care ethics where I discuss autobiography. A note first about the generic discursive status of autobiography. There is the himself, Paul Deman, and all others. That an autobiography is a genre without genre. It is contingent, it is whimsical, and nobody can claim a proper, adaptive, stable criteria for an autobiography. I can absolutely lie in an autobiography. Who is going to verify what I have written? I mean, Tagore, for instance, is in deep problem. Great disclosure was done by Taslima Nasreen. She's in deep problem. She had to, having had a defamation case, she had to correct delete certain names. Right. Now, if autobiography is so indulgent a narrative, it cannot be inscribed within those parameters. Rather, I'll say that it is the person who decides how I shall frame this autobiographical discourse. It is self-indulgent. And Deman, and there is all are sort of eloquent about this, and I've quoted them also. So, and about the personalist political, Arendt was one of the theorists who was most suspicious. That he said, the moment this private is brought to the public at an extreme point, this invokes the fascist, logic. So, this is the invasion of the social, as Arendt argued. So, typically if you try to erase the distinction, then what is the difference between a fascist appropriation or a dictatorial appropriation and neoliberal or a kind of emancipatory signifier, right? How that distinction, that appropriation would be distinguished, right? So, and Pradip also talks about the postmodern phase where there will be little difference between personal and private. Now, I don't mind, so-called the postmodern, the arrival of the postmodern and all kinds of heterosocial arguments, no problem with that. But if there is an erasure of these distinctions at one level, there is a consolidation of this distinction at another level. I mean, you look at the privacy, retort for, we are using the same privacy argument in order to confront the Aadhaar appropriation of biometric data. India or elsewhere. So there is an erasure at a point, there is consolidation at another point. But I'll say that the moment these distinctions cannot be avoided, they'll be more strengthened, but there will be an escape somewhere, right? This escape is the point where the personal arrives. And in my future work, actually, I try to show in terms of Chota, Rajan and Dawood and all kinds of friendship and alliances, how love and friendship are basically criminal complexes. How they are criminal emotions. All basically this kind of mafia groups, they are all deep friends. They're very good friends. And there were reports that all these are notorious friendship groups which are, in terms of Facebook and social media, these are, on Facebook, for instance, what is a request there? It's a friendship request, right? All kinds of dating websites and all kinds of stuff. Say for instance, Badiou has written a book where he tries to talk about these dating websites and those dating apps where if you subscribe to that app, right, and the risk, you'll have a partner, you'll go on dating, but what Badiou makes the point, and makes it quite well, that it removes the risk of indeterminacy which otherwise would have been built for love in everyday life. every life, on which Manusda makes a very strong point, and I appreciate it. And lastly, Pradipda talks about whether I am sort of subscribing to a personalist view or not. I've clarified this in the in the conclusion, that the personalists were basically, there was a theological gloss on personalism. There, the person was a supreme value, right? Now, if I am looking for a transubstantiation of values, as Nietzsche, as Manusda and Samirda pointed out, then it is not a value-laden supremacy I would, I would advocate for a person. As a in terms of a social and political argument, personalists were not making. Though the attack of Heidegger, for instance, on Max Scheller's idea of personalism, I have critiqued that a bit. But personalists were the first to point out, in some sense, that the person or the personal escapes those parameters. They were not talking in terms of private or public parameters. They were saying that the person is irreducible. This is one of the registers they used, and this irreducibility I tried to sort of juxtapose in terms of private and public. Now, Manusda, I welcome his observations. He is a friend and a teacher, and I owe him a lot, like Pradipda. And I'm sort of putting aside his appreciation, because that is taken. But the points that he make, I'll try to sort of make some points in response to. See, subject Budima's, utterances, right? Now, firstly, to describe this as personal, it shouldn't be a matter of volition. Manusda says, for instance, whether her intention is to place an enunciation which is personal or not. The moment of question of intentionality is, comes up. In terms of, a speech act theory, as Manusda knows it well, then an utterance becomes, understandable in some form because of its felicity conditions. If I say to Arya, that beautiful bald-headed friend of mine, clean shaven, right. So if I say, Arya, I'll kill you, he'll just laugh at me. But a mafia with a knife coming up, really, I'll kill you. The truth conditions of the two differ. It does not matter on what I'm uttering. It matters on the felicity conditions by which this utterance becomes true, understandable, personal, private, or whatever. And here, Samirda made a point that whatever is private, even though if we have knowledge, we might not be able to disseminate it, right? These restrictions play on every utterance that we make. And there was a great argument in terms of language, that the moment we make a statement, a language, right? A language, unless it is a sort of discrete set of marks which have no meaning otherwise, discrete set of, which is non-discursive in a sense. Any language otherwise, moment we speak a sentence, we are indulging in a linguistic practice. In this sense, a language always invokes a universal. Always invokes a universal, right? If we speak a language, we cannot avoid a universal, right? So,
but language also has that disruptive
potential. Well, you see, the disruptive potential of language, on which you have the famous Derrida-Austin debate, the misfire, the disruptive potential of language will always depend not on the language itself. Not on the language itself. Any language could be, any language could be used, deployed. You can use any sentence, but it would always have the disruptive potential in terms of certain felicity conditions, which will make the sentence disruptive. If I utter, say in a theater, for instance, you will utter any sentence. It might bring emotions, right? in terms of effectivity, the question that was asked. It might bring emotions in the sort of listeners or those who are watching, tears in the eyes. But still, it is a theatre. There is a dramaturgy. So the felicity conditions that I'm watching a cinema will always work, right? So the pleasure of viewing or the scopophilia itself, I mean, you cannot escape. I mean, this was Austin's point, and it was very well made. I mean, in terms of even misfire, certain norms are there by which a misfire is understood, right? And even Habermas sometimes repeats that conflation. That everyday language, for instance, there are poetic metaphors inscribed within everyday language. And everyday language also has poetic metaphors built into it. Can we sort of propose a disjunction, total disjunction between a poetic language and an everyday language? No. So this interpenetration, intertextuality between, this hybridity between the poetic language or anything, or a criminal language, whatever, clinical language, for instance. When I say that, for instance, you're looking sick, or a woman, for instance, complains, oh guy, you're completely sick, right? You're a complete perv. This is in terms invoking a clinical language, and which penetrates everyday discourse and everyday language, right? So, so far as the bringing up of normalized citizens and governance, the question that Manoj invoked, the question of, I've discussed in chapter 4, basically, I've discussed Foucault and his notion of governmentality and government of the social, where I discuss extensively Foucault's proposal of governmentality and in terms of government of the social. But, this link between Burima's utterance and the bringing up of states, the way a state would try to bring up normalized citizenry, normalized and temperamentally seduced citizens. I think what is being granted here is complete sort of agency to the state, where there is a state will or a state intention, but the state, in terms of a personality viewpoint, the state is, in terms of absent, but still yet a collective personality, by which the way one would say, I am the state. Louis XIV perhaps said, I am the state. It was horrifying, but in a sense, one knows it's true. When one, approaches a minister who says, well, I am the law, it sounds true. How is that possible? So, right, but I've also argued, and that is found in chapter 4, that much of Foucault's, his points of beginning were borrowed from Marshall, actually. T.H. Marshall, who was tinkering with this kind of stuff, and he borrowed much from social work. So, solitude to publicity, Rousseau, Manoj's point is a very refreshing point. But what I'll say in terms of Rousseau, I've discussed Rousseau in terms of his discussion of, his invocation of public person. I've quoted Rousseau also. But in terms of confession, Augustine or Aquina or this whole confessional discourse also, and the transition from solitude to publicity, if there's a transition here, right? If there's a departure here, if there's a linking up from solitude to publicity, to disclosure, the question is, in terms of a personality frame, who does this? Who does this? How is this possible? The person does this. The person decides to disclose. The person, now in terms of an unconscious, one might argue that, is he fully conscious when he's trying to, disclose in terms of an autobiography, right? But this unconscious, how do we know that we do not know? This unconscious could be invoked everywhere. And this question has already been sounded. How is one conscious about the unconscious? Why is this region that the unconscious had to be structured in terms of, symbolic, and in terms of the unconscious, structured like a language. This had to be invoked, and the later revolution that has happened. I mean, psychoanalysis had to be totally reinvented, right? When you say that the unconscious is structured like a language, I'll say, again, we have entered the frame of the universal, right? So, so in terms of subjectivity or affectivity, I don't have any quarrel about affectivity or emotions. I mean, the way the personal, figures or masquerades. Okay, so the female mode of production with Kluge is a very interesting point, and the secular ethic of care, Manas has already invoked in terms of welfare state. But the last point about private drinking and secret drinking, in terms of Gandhi, I think I've engaged extensively in that. But private drinking and sacred drinking, this was a distinction made by Gandhi. So Motilal was actually denouncing this distinction. He says, I don't think there's a distinction between private drinking and secret drinking. But I've tried to figure secret in terms of deep private. So in terms of a deep private, where it has been argued by Shomida, I think, that private is knowable in some forms. We know the private rules are quite explicit. But when you say secret, it is a deep private in which, it is quite indeterminate as to which private will be secret and which private will be not. In terms of, for instance, an architectonic combination of the private, one might say, and it has been mentioned also, the bathroom, for instance, the toilet or the bedroom, are the deep private spheres actually, and not necessarily the kitchen or the drawing room. Okay, so fine. So I remember, for instance, last point on civil society, Manas has emphasized, but in terms of Hegel and the way it was invoked in 19th century Bengal, the way it was instituted by Ram Mohan Roy and Keshav Sen and civil society in the colonies, particularly Hegel's discussion, I've discussed this extensively. Ferguson I remember because Ferguson's book is basically an engagement with how literature contributed to the invention of civil society. So in terms of, say, I remember Ferguson was invoked by Seligman, for instance. Adam Seligman's in the idea of civil society, even Arato and Cohen, they discuss it. But in terms of that chapter, specifically, civil society in the colonies, I mean Hegel and civil society in the colonies, I'm not sure how Ferguson will, institute that revision. What departure will Ferguson make? So that has to be clarified. And I think Manas's written paper, when I have it, I think will make it clear. So lastly, finally, Shomirza, I've referred to him anecdotally, but there are some very important questions that he makes. One is, Ami shop jani, Ami public kore do. What is the extent of threshold? Now, the extent of threshold is contingent. It is empirical, right? But and this empirical, contingent, indeterminate threshold will have nothing against the proposal of the personal as not private or public. Private do not escape social rules. Yes, of course, I agree with you. There are norms of privacy. But the feminist argument and objection against the masculinist discourse was this, that men basically, by invoking the cloak of privacy, they deny the rules of privacy. They violate the rules of privacy. The normative rules of privacy are violated by men. Okay, so and Diderot is interesting. I've referred to Diderot in terms of political pornography. He had a book called Memoirs of the Nun, where those times, French Revolution, underground pornographic literature, scatological literature, I've dealt with it extensively. Now, in terms of personal identity and disidentity, this question has come up. I've discussed this in terms of Rakhi Sawant and all. I'll settle this, try to sort of respond to it in brief here. Now, identity, as you know, is a kind of self-sameness, right? I am what I am. This is my identity. I must remain what I am in terms of through time and over space, right? But as I said, as I've written this here, that if I'm totally immersed in my own self, what will happen is, for instance, the erasure of distinctions. A salesman, for instance, will be absorbed in the language of salesmanship. He will, for instance, go to, his own house, and he will sort of sell his pen to the wife, saying, it's a birthday gift, but he will say, this pen is good, right? This will last long. So, identity not in terms of, there is identity in terms of self-centeredness, in terms of continuity. But there's always a disjunction between what I am and what I don't want to be, right? So there is a disidentity, right? I am not absorbed in my own roles always. I might, I might go to a theater and I might play the role of a king, but I'm not absorbed in the role of a king totally. So this distance, this pathos of distance, will say that I've emphasized more on the disidentity rather than the question of identity. Okay. And finally, the last two questions posed by Samirda is the question of collective person, where do my determinate sympathies lie? See, I have no illusion about liberal democracy. I have tried to show in the first chapter where the everyday language of maneuver, exploitation, right? Where the everyday language of manipulation, of coercion, of seductive gift, and the overriding of rules have destroyed people more than those who, Kant makes that point, and I quote it, that open violence is ethical, is normative. But sacred malice, backstabbing, is absolutely, a slur on humanity. So what liberal democracy hides through these distinctions, and what dictatorship or a monarchical authoritarian, it's open violence, right? It's absolutely open. But one example would suffice. It was becoming too long, so I did not quote this in the first chapter, but in the second edition I'll put it. Amit Kumar, for instance, Kishore Kumar's son. He was questioned in an interview which I read that, Amit, you are Kishore Kumar's son, you have excellent voice. Everybody says, what happened to you? You said, and this, after having read that interview, again I came across this interview on Rajya Sabha TV. And you can have that on YouTube by Googling, by searching Amit Kumar, Guftagu with Amit Kumar. He says this again, that everything is true. Bapa was there, I had, a good beginning, I had good voice, everything. But Papa taught me singing. Well, Papa didn't teach me another thing. So the questioner said, what? He said, politics. I said, politics? What politics? He said, he gives, all kinds of, when everything, recording has been done, everything, he had returned to home for lunch. There he receives a phone call where it is said that you were not required to come for the recording. Then he said that I had some connections, I inquired. That there was an obscure phone call which came, and somebody else was called for the recording. So how in terms of, everyday governmentality, private, public, distinction, can you explain this? This is a maneuver which keeps all, and we all have this kind of stories. I remember somebody sitting here, I won't name him. He had an excellent article, if I remember it truly. It was to be published. And somebody from an eminent research center who was one of his dear colleague. He had written a letter saying, a Bengali version in a local journal was published before that it has already been published. Why are you publishing? Now, they didn't care much, but look at the extent of this maneuver. Can public rules or private norms of non-violation, can it account for this? This man was this scholar was stunned, but what is this? So my question of politics in a personalistic frame looks at this kind of everyday maneuver, exploitation and kind of stuff, okay? So I have no illusion about liberal democracy. I have no illusion. But in terms of riot that you posed, that is my last point, that the riots in terms of riots, I think wherever riots happen, are instituted, a question of community comes up. Now, this question has been posed. The community does not have an outside, right? The community does not have an outside, and so the riot, the question of the collective personality of the crowd, of the rioting crowd, of the group, obviously has to be explored. And I think much has been said in terms of Sudhir Kakar or collective unconscious or whatever, the colors of violence or whatever. I mean, so, one does not, one skips from one identity to another. This is absolutely okay. I mean, he does. In terms of disidentity, this is what I propose. That Rakhi Sawant, he says, in home, I'm absolutely, I design my home, everything, and I don't allow anybody to come up and try to, fix up a price or whatever. So this transition from one role to another, right? This is what I propose in order to dispel the aura of identity. Is the question of personal agency is more important than the question of identity. It has had us for long, and in this actually I critique Amartya Sen, who tries to propose tolerance for multiple identities. I am officer, I am homemaker at home, I am officer outside. No. I mean, it's not that at one moment I am all identities at once, right? It's not that. It has to be a different point of time where you are an officer. It's not the same point, right? So the question of multiple identities is multiple selves, in a sense, is falsely posited to invoke toleration. Because the question of toleration is an empirical and contingent question. I mean, because it's not at the same point that you have all identities at once, right? The question of toleration is absolutely contingent, and again, it will depend on various kinds of felicity conditions. Now, this question of toleration can be proposed in, a very tolerant way, and Leslie Green, who is, I'm very fond of this man as a jurist, philosopher of law at Oxford, he proposed it very well, that who likes to be tolerated, right? The toleration is a question invoked long ago, which is the history from Locke and all. For us, for instance, toleration is a question. It's absolutely a marginal question. It's a contingent question. It's an arbitrary chaos by which toleration could be invoked, right? And the question of Gierke and Maitland, as was invoked by Shomirda, I've used Gierke's book here in translation also. But the main point that I would try to sort of make, that Shomirda sort of spotted an authoritarian core, a spirit, authoritarian moment in the book, that is there. But as you know, the plural personality of the state in those days, and the way Gierke and Maitland tried to construe it, that it was the multiple personality of states as various associations. I mean, any group, when I say collective personality, I've used this here in terms of firms or corporations, right? So there, they were trying to pose that all kinds of groups, for instance, if you have a club, now, if sovereignty is if it's divided between various forms of associations, then state will be just one association. And if sovereignty is divided, then the state cannot declare for itself that it is a supremely sovereign entity. Now, if this disjunction, this division happens, then it will lead to a kind of plurality and a liberal atmosphere rather than an authoritarian and a kind of collective supremacy. So this argument is also there, wherefrom you can derive a liberal spirit. With this, I end. Thank you all. We'll meet again. Right. Yeah.